Hello everybody and welcome to my ranking of the Sonic movies. This is my first full-length YouTube video, so I thought I'd introduce myself a bit. My channel name, ROTSA2, is a combination between my favorite Star Wars movie, Revenge of the Sith, or ROTS, and my favorite Sonic game, Sonic Adventure 2, or SA2. And I don't fully know what my YouTube channel is really gonna be yet, but with Sonic 3 out now, I think now is a better time than ever to rank the 3 Sonic movies from worst to best. Without any further ado, let's get right into this. In last place, Sonic the Hedgehog 2020, the original. Now this movie was very important to me when it first came out, as it turned me into a true Sonic fan. I had known quite a bit about Sonic before this movie came out. I actually discovered Sonic through LEGO Dimensions and played a few games like Sonic 1, 2, Generations, and a couple of mobile games. But this movie is what truly made me into a fan. Now, almost 5 years later, geez, I can't believe it's actually been that long. Damn. Anyway, now I've played almost every Sonic game. Sonic Adventure 2 is my favorite video game of all time, and I write Sonic fanfiction almost daily. I mean, I'm not just a Sonic fan, it's a lifestyle, and that's all thanks to this movie. But the tricky question is, almost a half-decade later, 2 more movies have been released, both of which have raised the stakes and added more characters and action. And I specifically know pretty much everything there is to know about Sonic. With that in mind, do I think this movie holds up all this time later? Not entirely. I feel like by today's standards for the franchise, it feels like the movie equivalent of a video game demo. All of the pieces were there, but they weren't quite used up to their full potential, and they weren't put together in a way that felt fully cohesive or that made it feel like a Sonic movie. For example, the chase scene at the end where Robotnik chases Sonic through the warp rings, really cool. It felt like a Sonic stage, and the part where they came face to face at the end of the chase was very clever because it felt like the boss fight at the end of a stage. However, this seemed like the kind of action that should be sprinkled throughout the whole movie, but we only got one scene of it at the end. Sonic and Robotnik don't directly fight until the 3rd act. This movie is surprisingly light on action. We have the car chase on the highway, and we have the final chase. That's it. Okay, we also have the scene where Sonic slows down time at the bar, but that's more of a gag. Sonic is a character whose main purpose is to go fast, but for too much of this movie, they just put him in a car. And not in a cool way like this. This just made it feel like a safe, generic family movie and barely like Sonic at all. Of course, there are a lot of other great parts of this movie. Jim Carrey was absolutely born to play Robotnik, and he steals every single scene he's in. I also think Ben Schwartz did a great job of playing this immature, inexperienced Sonic who's at an early stage of his heroic career. But you know who I'm not a big fan of in this movie is James Marsden. Tom is a very bland character, and his boring, generic character arc takes up way too much of the runtime. Now, I think that his dynamic with Sonic is pretty good, but as a character on his own merits, he's just hard to really care about. I definitely still think it's an entertaining movie. I think they definitely got the tone right, whether that's the general vibe or the visual style. It's also really cool to see Sonic's origin, which is sort of an angle of the character that we've never seen in the games. And it was very important both for video game adaptations moving forward and the quality of the Sonic series as a whole, including the games. In a way, because of how popular this movie was, the games that followed it were much higher quality. But I would recommend this movie to newcomers way more than diehard fans who haven't seen it. Our runner-up is Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Now, looking at this movie compared to the first one, it's quite impressive how much of an increase in quality it is. After Sonic 1 was a safe family road trip movie, Sonic 2 was a globe-trotting adventure with world-threatening stakes, deep ancient lore, and not one but 2 characters from the games added. Now that's an upgrade. And I think all this new stuff makes it feel way more like a Sonic movie than the first one. For starters, Sonic 1 just had Sonic, Robotnik, and a bunch of random humans. Sonic 2, on the other hand, introduces Tails and Knuckles. Not only does this world being populated by more characters from the games make it feel more like Sonic, these are the best versions of these characters that we've seen, I'd say, since Sonic Adventure 2. In many recent Sonic games up to this point, the supporting cast had been treated as caricatures. For example, Tails, specifically in Sonic Forces, was just a scaredy cat who was always off on the sidelines. But here, he is a smart, curious kid who contrasts Sonic quite well, like the character we've loved from the start, and they didn't even need to get a new voice actor. Likewise, Knuckles has just been this dumb, comic relief character for way too long. When I first saw this movie, I wasn't a huge fan of Idris Elba in this role, but he's definitely grown on me with time. Either way, the writing for him is great. His dumbness is still used for comic relief, but he's not dumb because he's like actually dumb. He's more of a fish out of water. He's unfamiliar with this world, but still serious about accomplishing his goals. Characters aren't the only thing that makes it feel more like a Sonic movie. The story and structure feel like they're inspired specifically by Sonic Adventure. We have this MacGuffin story that is fast-paced without sacrificing world building, is taken seriously while still having time for humor and lighthearted moments. The thing that has always impressed me about this movie is all the connections it makes to the first one. It answered why there were echidnas after Sonic and connected it to Knuckles, making these movies have a refreshingly consistent continuity. And of course, this is a more action-packed movie. There's over double the amount of action that the first movie had, and every single action sequence is pulled straight out of the games. However, while this movie definitely shows progress from the first one, there's still a lot of things they had to iron out. For starters, the human subplot. At the same time as writing a solid Sonic story, the writers were also interested in putting the humans in this generic, insignificant wedding plot that barely has anything to do with the rest of the story. It's almost like watching a great Sonic movie with tons of commercial breaks. I guess the argument could be made that this is something for adults while the kids enjoy the Sonic characters, but then they'd be forgetting how much of the Sonic fanbase is adults who played the older games when they were kids, or adults who are currently playing the Sonic games. The frustrating thing is that because this was such a big part of the movie, but they also had to make it tight, it really takes away from the main plot. Almost the entire second act is centered around this perspective. Then they tacked on the introduction of Gun, which had no significance except setting up the next movie. This is something that many middle chapters are guilty of. But just think, they could have put all the time, money, and energy of this human perspective into making Tails a more important character, or properly developing Sonic and Tails' friendship. But nope, because so much of the movie's runtime was focused on the humans, they rushed developing Sonic and Tails' dynamic with a lame dance-off with a bunch of Russians. And almost nothing that happens in the second act or the entirety of the human subplot goes anywhere. Basically, the whole wedding and gun plot was resolved, and then as soon as we got to the temple fight, all of these characters and storylines were completely forgotten. So I'd say that the first act of this movie is pretty good, the second act is way too human-centric, and the third act is just everything you'd want. All of the best action, the best spectacle, and the best character moments are in the last 40 minutes of this movie. So while this movie has a bit too much of what a Sonic movie shouldn't be, when it's at its best, it's everything a Sonic movie should be. But coming in at number 1 is Sonic the Hedgehog 3. After the first two Sonic movies were spent sort of figuring out the formula and doing experiments to see what works and what doesn't, this is the movie where the franchise has finally found its distinct voice. I think one major factor of this is that they are allowed to do more now. Since Sonic 1 and 2 were able to attract a whole new generation of fans, to a certain extent myself included, the franchise can now go deeper into the Sonic canon without trying too hard to appeal to a broader audience. So now that they've figured out the formula, we have this more focused and polished Sonic movie. There is no human subplot, there are no cringeworthy gags, the story has no interruptions and completely centers around the characters we want to see: Team Sonic, Shadow, and the Robotniks. This refined approach allows for the movie to move at an ultra-fast pace. It's quite a short movie, clocking at only 109 minutes, but still a lot happens because it speeds through its narrative without rushing or diminishing any single plot point. Of course, the big new addition to this movie is Shadow the Hedgehog, who adds a new edge to the franchise. Much like in the games, he is a broken, vengeful character with a traumatic past, and that adds more depth, intrigue, and darkness to contrast the more comedic side of the grander series. Ever since the first movie came out, Keanu Reeves was always my first pick to play Shadow. Here, they actually got him, and he did as good of a job as I could have hoped. He made Shadow sound urgent and traumatized while also being laid back, and these aspects of his personality are exactly why I thought he was a good casting in the first place. The other big new thing in this movie is having two Robotniks, two Jim Carreys. He was already one of the best parts of the last two movies, so duplicating all of that energy and slapstick humor just makes it all even better. Gerald Robotnik is a different enough character to feel unique, but also similar enough to match Ivo Robotnik's signature manic energy. Both of these new characters and their arcs somehow connect to the existing characters. Shadow's tragic backstory makes him a rival to Sonic, not only in powers, but in how he handles his fate, and the idea of different ways of handling trauma becomes an overarching theme throughout the whole movie. Likewise, the Robotniks have this evil family dynamic that has an overarching theme of its own, and that is destroying the world versus conquering it, the two sides of the idea of evil. Man, I am dissecting this thing down to its core. Anyway, along with the new characters, the returning cast shines more than ever. Sonic is a little more mature in this movie, the guardian aspect of Knuckles becomes a more important part of his character, and most notably, Tails gets a more important role. Tails is my favorite Sonic character, and I thought he was very underutilized in the last movie, so seeing him have a more important role in this story is very satisfying. Now that they're more of a developed team, we got a better look at the dynamic between Team Sonic, and it's just a reminder of how great of a team they are. The other thing this movie does is crank the action up to 11. The action stays consistent with the last few movies, but goes bigger than ever. And once the movie got to the third act, there was some of the biggest, most uniquely epic action I've ever seen in a blockbuster. Much like its predecessors, the action was pulled straight out of the games, but here it went further over the top than ever, and that is a good thing, because over the top is something Sonic should be. The other thing this movie went bigger on was the humor. It hit harder than ever with some of the best jokes I've heard all year. And the thing they really improved is the sequencing of the jokes. They knew when to be funny and when to be more serious or emotional. And the humor never diminished any of the more serious plot points. The final thing I'll mention about this movie is that it is essentially an adaptation of Sonic Adventure 2. Like I said before, my favorite video game of all time. This is pretty much exactly the adaptation I wanted. It was very faithful to its source material, with Shadow's backstory, and Gerald's whole overarching plan being not exactly the same, but very close to what they were in the game. There's also a lot of scenes, shots, and even quotes taken directly from Sonic Adventure 2. However, it was different enough that there were still surprises, and I was still intrigued to know what was going to happen next. It's a movie that has a very strong narrative, but also has fan service, and I think that this should be the norm for blockbusters. In conclusion, Sonic 1 was a fun start to the series, but it was way too safe. Sonic 2 was inconsistent, but a top-notch Sonic movie when it was at its best. And Sonic 3 is an ultra fast-paced, high-stakes, narratively strong movie that has allowed this franchise to find its voice and become possibly one of the most credible movie franchises for the rest of the current decade. With how promising Sonic 3's post-credit scenes were and how much potential this series has, I can't wait to see what else they have in store. If you're watching this, I encourage you to leave your ranking of the 3 Sonic movies in the comments below. If you want, leave the Knuckles show in there as well. I haven't seen it, but if you have, leave it in your ranking. Just remember to keep it spoiler-free, and if not, add a warning. Thanks for watching, guys.